Quick question to start us off. How many of you would say you rely on your mobile phone quite a lot? Your cell phone? Pretty much, most people. Would it surprise you if I told you that one of the main reasons you have a cell phone, or at least a major reason that you have a cell phone in your pocket, is because of a TV show? This guy is Martin Cooper. He was one of the team at Motorola who designed the first mobile phone, that is, the first mobile phone, that giant brick there. The ancestor to all the smartphones in your pockets. He was inspired by Star Trek. He said that Star Trek made dreaming legitimate. And I think that was a huge contribution to his development of the mobile phone. If anyone's seen the original 1960s version of Star Trek, they have these flip-open communicators where they can talk to the ship over long distance. At the time, that kind of technology was complete fantasy, but it inspired Martin to go and develop the real thing, and now we basically have that in our everyday lives. I have a clicker here, I could use that. Now, Star Trek was created by a man called Gene Roddenberry, and his whole purpose with Star Trek was to essentially communicate a certain philosophy, a certain view of life. As Ayn Rand, as you know, famously said, art is a selective recreation of reality that serves to embody or communicate the artist's value judgments, the artist's view of the world. And Roddenberry used science fiction to do that in a particular way. He said, science fiction is a way of thinking, a way of logic that bypasses a lot of nonsense. It allows people to look directly at important subjects. What he meant by bypasses a lot of nonsense is that by moving issues away from Earth, away from our everyday context, it takes people away from their existing ideas, their existing emotional attachments to real-world issues. So if you do a TV show about a current crisis, a current war, you do something about COVID or something about Ukraine, one of these contexts, people are going to bring their existing ideas about that situation to play. If you set it in space and do it with aliens, nobody has that. You can tell the same story, make all the same points, but people don't bring their emotional baggage with it. So Roddenberry thought that science fiction was a way to tell stories by allegory, tell them in a different world, in a different place, but convey important messages that apply to our lives today. And science fiction and fantasy are both genres that enable you to do this. But I want to focus on science fiction today because it enables you not only to talk about important moral issues and politics and history and that kind of thing, but also talk about science and reason, which I think are really important values as well. And just to note, by the way, I'm going to talk about various TV shows and a few books as well. Don't worry if you don't keep track of all the names. I'll have a list of them at the end so you can look at that if you've missed any of the names. Also, I want to just note, I'm mostly not going to talk about Star Wars. I don't consider Star Wars to be science fiction. I think it's space fantasy. I like Star Wars, but I don't think it's science fiction. There's not any science in it. So don't expect me to talk about Star Wars much. But I will talk about a lot of other stuff. You may know it, you may not, but I'll try and give you a sense of why I think it's valuable. So like I said, Roddenberry used Star Trek to allegorically deal with real-world issues. And he was making the show in the 1960s. And in America in the 1960s, as you may well know, race was a really important issue. You had the legacy of segregation still in large chunks of the United States. The civil rights movement was still very much a thing at that point. And you basically couldn't talk about race on network TV. You couldn't do a show that just dealt with America's current race issues. You wouldn't get funding, you wouldn't get shown, and it certainly as an entertainment product. So what Roddenberry did, as I said, is used other worlds as allegories and science fiction concepts to enable him to tell those stories. This picture on the left here is from an episode where there's this planet full of people who have half black, half white faces, but a small minority are born the other way around, with the black on the other side and the white on the other side. And they're a persecuted minority, their rights aren't respected. And it's a very obvious black and white, if you like, allegory for America's race issues. But it got past the censors, it got past all the network executives because it was doing it in another context. Star Trek, the original series, was also famous for putting a black woman on the bridge of the Enterprise, which at the time, the idea of a black woman in that sort of position of authority, a black person or a woman, let alone both, was quite shocking and unexpected on American network television, and it didn't happen in the real world at that stage, in American context. And Roddenberry was very brave in doing that, and a lot of people said it wasn't believable, but people bought it when it actually went out. And he actually put the first interracial kiss on American television in Star Trek, which is that picture on the right there. You couldn't really do that as a story at the time, so what he did is he had an alien take control of these two characters and make them kiss. So in the context of the story, it wasn't really happening, but nevertheless broke that taboo on television, and then other people could then follow and do it more fully. And in this respect, science fiction often leads the way in depicting things that are outside what's considered acceptable at the time, and it can often set the standard that then others can follow. Now, as I say, I'm going to talk about a lot of science fiction, but I want to differentiate two different types of science fiction first. There is what I call the pessimistic side of science fiction and the optimistic side of science fiction. Like I said earlier, art is about selection. What do you choose to incorporate in your art? What do you put in your TV show or your book or whatever you're creating? What you select says a lot about what you value, what you're conveying. Some science fiction, a lot of science fiction, is very negative, very nihilistic, very pessimistic in its selections. This is a screenshot from the 2003 version of Battlestar Galactica. It's a very dark, very depressing series if you've ever seen it. The overall theme you get by the end of the show, if you can actually make it all the way to the end of the show, is that our lives are pretty much hopeless. We're stuck in a cycle of our technology destroying us. It's full of just suffering and pain, beginning to end. There's a lot of cool space battles. There's some fun sequences. I'm not saying it's all bad, but the overall message of the show is very negative, very depressing. And that's very much the pessimistic side of science fiction, which I don't want to emphasize tonight. And as well as that, there's some shows that just convey other bad values. There's a show called Lex from the 90s, which I couldn't make it through because it was just all about hedonism. It was all about having sex and partying and just, flying around the galaxy, just being debaucherous, and there was no positive values in it at all. So there are shows like that and works like that, and that's quite a large chunk of science fiction. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people see that as the bulk of science fiction, that very negative side of things. And by the way, you can tell a negative story for a positive reason. So I'm sure you're familiar with dystopian books, things like 1984, which use a negative setting to tell an important positive value. And that's a valuable thing to do. And there are some science fiction shows, I'll talk about one later called Blake 7, which does that very well. But a lot of this is just pessimism and nihilism for the sake of it, and that's very much what I want to avoid and want to discourage. On the contrary, what I want to encourage is this kind of vision of the future, this kind of optimism, which is embodied most of all, I think, by Star Trek, but by a number of other series as well. Incidentally, Battlestar Galactica that I just talked about was created by a guy called Ronald Moore, and he created it because he was frustrated as a writer on Star Trek that he couldn't be negative. He had to be optimistic, he had to be positive, and he found that really frustrating, and he wanted to tell these depressing stories, and so he went and made Battlestar instead. But I like that about Star Trek, that the whole message of Star Trek is that this is the kind of civilization we might achieve one day, a spacefaring, flourishing society where we're wealthy, where people are healthy, live long lives, and we can travel across the galaxy with ease. So that's the kind of vision of the future I want to talk about. There are 8 values I've identified that optimistic, positive science fiction conveys, which I think are really important values for creating a flourishing future in our society. And they are curiosity, determination, science and technology, reason, individualism, freedom, civilization, and life. And that's the order I'm going to present them in, sort of going from the more concrete to the more abstract. You'll see the progression as we go through. Values, as you probably know, are those things that we strive to obtain and maintain, things that we want to achieve in our world. So I'll start with curiosity. And curiosity is something that's usually associated with two kinds of being, with children and with cats. It's not normally associated with sort of mature adults. I think that's a problem with our society. I think curiosity is something we should associate with adulthood. It's one of those aspects of childhood that we should try and bring with us into adulthood and not lose the way I think we often do. And curiosity is the thing that motivates us to discover new things about the world, new ways of enhancing our lives, new ways of flourishing, new art forms, new technologies, ways of living longer, ways of finding meaning finding about our history, where we came from, that kind of thing. And one of my favorite things about science fiction on a sort of surface level is that it really encourages curiosity. There's a gif of Spock from the original series of Star Trek using his famous catchphrase, fascinating, which he says to practically everything that they encounter and everything they do. And that kind of open curiosity is something I love. Just the open enjoyment, the open experience of finding the world interesting, all the things around us, nature, technology, actually interesting and motivating. By the way, when I talk about different shows, I try to put the logos in the corner, so that will help you understand what I'm talking about. Now, Carl Sagan, the famous popularizer of science, once said, if you go talk to kindergartners or first grade kids, so young children in school, you find a class full of science enthusiasts. They ask deep questions. They ask things like, what is a dream? Why do we have toes? Why is the moon round? Why is the birthday of the world? Why is grass green? These are profound, important questions, and they just bubble right out of these kids. But if you go talk to 12th graders at the other end of school, there's none of that. They've become incurious. Something terrible has happened between kindergarten and 12th grade. Something has gone on in the school process where young children, young adults lose their curiosity. I went through school, and I think I have some ideas about why that happened. For me, there were two factors, really. One was that there was a peer pressure around me from the other kids not to be curious. It was nerdy, it was geeky, it was unusual. And the peer pressure was, if you wanted to fit in with most people, you talked about sports, you talked about music, but you didn't talk about space. You didn't talk about dinosaurs. You didn't talk about whatever thing you might be curious about. It was seen as childish. It was seen as geeky and nerdy. That's one thing. If you want to fit in, it's difficult to if you're highly curious. The other reason is that school, I think, makes learning boring. It makes discovering things about reality seem like this sort of monotonous chore. I think many schools, this isn't true of every school, it's not true of every teacher. We all have hopefully had good teachers that made things interesting. But a lot of the time, a school will take a fascinating subject. It could be a great work of literature, it could be a fascinating period of history or a fascinating piece of science, and it will make it this boring thing where you have to memorize and regurgitate information and you don't really care, you don't really understand why it matters. That was my whole problem with math, by the way, or maths, is that you learn all these theorems and you never understand why they matter, like how do you use them in day-to-day life. So school disconnects information learning from the values that make it important. And I think a lot of kids lose curiosity for that reason. They associate learning with the monotony of school. But as I said, curiosity and learning are vitally important things for our lives, not just for building a better society, but for building better lives as individuals. It fills your life with detail, with complexity, with things to do, things to learn about. When you can walk down the street and everything around you is potentially interesting. Every little detail there's a world of possibilities around us. As I said, Star Trek embodies that idea in droves, and I quite like this quote from Captain Kirk, where he says, "The greatest danger facing us is ourselves, an irrational fear of the unknown. But there's no such thing as the unknown, only the things temporarily hidden, temporarily not understood." We shouldn't fear new discoveries. We talked about AI earlier in Esther's talk. There's a lot of fear around that at the moment. But once it becomes a known thing, at one time there was a lot of fear about the internet, and now we know what it is and we know what we're dealing with. At one time there was a lot of fear about steam engines and the idea of traveling at higher speeds than horses could. People thought that if you traveled on a train in the early 19th century, they thought if you traveled on a train you wouldn't be able to breathe because of how fast you were traveling. Every time you went into a tunnel, the air pressure would kill you. All these fears that people had, and now we say the same stuff about space travel, that you won't be able to survive the radiation and things like that. We'll find solutions, it will become commonplace, but people treat the unknown as something to fear, not something to embrace. And this very much provides the opposite worldview, the idea that the unknown is something to embrace, something to enjoy, something to get value from, because that's where the value is. It's out there in the things we haven't discovered yet. Another series that's really good for expressing this idea of curiosity is Doctor Who, a show that's run for about 60 years now, back home in England. And it's been promoting the value of curiosity pretty much that entire time. On the left, you've got the fourth Doctor there from the 1970s saying, there's no point being grown up if you can't be childish sometimes. What's the point of adulting, as people say now, if you can't enjoy life, if you can't indulge in a bit of curiosity, a bit of play, those things that we developed as animals in order to survive and grow and flourish and become the sort of people, become the civilization we have, because we're the animals that use our minds, that wonder, that explore, that consider these things. And then in the newer Doctor Who, you get the same idea. This image is from an episode where the Doctor Who travels in time and space, if you don't know. He lands on this human outpost that's suspended above a black hole. It's this very dangerous place, and he's astonished that humans have come to this place. And he says, why did you come here? I'll tell you why, because it was there. Brilliant. Human beings, you're amazing. So he's saying, you saw this thing that shouldn't exist, this planet that's suspended over a black hole, and you just said, I'm going to go there, I'm going to find out why that's like that. And that episode actually has a clip that captures another respect in which these shows embody the value of curiosity. And that is that they teach you about science. They get Doctor Who's aimed a lot at younger viewers, at children and teenagers, and it gets them interested in these concepts by showing you how potentially interesting these things are. I'll just play you this little clip. Hopefully it'll work. There are British accents in here, by the way, ones that are not as clear as mine. So if you don't follow the dialogue, I'll explain the gist of it afterwards, but hopefully you get the sense of how this encourages curiosity. Oh, I want that to stop. There we go. So I've moved on to the next slide. We'll talk about that in a moment. But I love how that clip just, if you're an 8-year-old kid watching this show and you discover from it what a black hole is, it's this thing that attracts everything, it eats everything, even light can't escape. That's a fascinating concept to begin with, not to mention all of the things that are still not understood about black holes. We know they exist now for certain, but we don't understand why they are the way they are and what goes on in the core of them. It's a fascinating piece of science, and people watching this grow up and become physicists and study these issues. I think that's a beautiful way that television can encourage curiosity. I would much rather a kid were watching Doctor Who than watching something that just didn't imbue any of that. And curiosity doesn't need to be about space. It can be about all sorts of things. It can be about nature. It can be about history. And I'm focusing on science fiction because I love the values that science fiction specifically expresses, but anything that gets people interested about the world around them, I think is good and valuable. And if any of you are interested in writing and creating fiction, please go out there and do that and get people interested in these sorts of things. So the next value I wanted to talk about is determination, because curiosity only gets you so far. Curiosity, gets you interested, gets you asking the questions. But if you want to go out and find the answers to those questions, you have to be prepared to fight over a lot of obstacles. If anyone's followed the history of the space program or followed SpaceX and the Falcon rocket program with Elon Musk more recently, it's a process of overcoming hurdles, of dealing with failure, frequently dealing with failure. And the same thing is true, by the way, of defending liberty and stuff like that. It's a constant process of resistance and fortitude in the face of difficulty. And that's another value that permeates science fiction. This is a clip from Star Trek Enterprise, which is one of the more recent Star Trek series that came out in the early 2000s. It's one of my favorites, actually. And it takes place in a really early period of human space exploration. So it's set before all the other Star Trek shows. It's set when humans are sort of just going out into the galaxy for the first time. And we have some allies called the Vulcans. And the Vulcans think that we're not ready to go into the galaxy yet. They think we're not mature enough, we're not peaceful enough, we're too violent, we're too irrational, we're too emotional. And Captain Archer, his father invented the engine that's going to carry us into the stars, and he wants to see it happen. He thinks that human beings are ready, and he's prepared to deal with anything that he has to encounter along the way. And I love this clip for a little speech that he gives about why it's important that we go into space.
Within minutes, the baby was standing up on its own. A few more minutes, and it was walking, and before I knew it, it was running alongside its mother, moving away with a herd. Humans aren't like that, Ambassador. We may come from the same planet as those gazelles, but we're pretty much helpless when we're born. It takes us months before we're able to crawl, almost a full year before we can walk. Our deep space mission isn't much different. We're going to stumble, make mistakes, I'm sure more than a few before we find our footing. But we're going to learn from those mistakes. That's what being human is all about. I'm sorry you can't see that.
We're going to learn from those mistakes. That's what being human is all about. And that is how we have invented every technology we've ever invented, pretty much. The Wright brothers crashed a lot of planes. SpaceX crashed a lot of rockets. NASA crashed a lot of rockets in their development and in their operation. Accidents happen in the course of research and innovation, but you don't get a better life without doing that. We're all here enjoying the comforts and pleasantries of Western civilization because a lot of people took a lot of risks to make these technologies possible. I love the fact that this show expresses that message directly. And the theme song from Star Trek Enterprise was kind of controversial among Star Trek fans because it had a song rather than like a classical piece of music. But I actually quite like the song. And the main thing it's talking about is the idea that if you believe in your ability to succeed and your own mind's ability to deal with things, you can achieve virtually anything that reality allows. I can reach any star is sort of metaphorical and also literal. We can go to any star if we try hard enough. But we can deal with any challenge as long as we apply ourselves. The show is all about determination. You see that in a lot of science fiction, but Enterprise is one of my favorite examples. And so once you develop all these technologies and achieve them, we have this flourishing civilization, and yet there are still a lot of people who lament technology, who see it as a threat or see it as something that somehow degrades us, alienates us from the world. And again, a lot of the negative side of science fiction is kind of anti-technological. It's dealing with the dangers, threats that technology poses. A lot of stuff, think of Terminator, think of Blade Runner, think of the recent movie The Creator, if anyone saw that. They're all about how people might use technologies to dominate the world, or just machines might take over. Star Trek always had the opposite attitude. It showed a future in which technology improves our lives even more. And looking at history, that's probably what's going to happen. It'll make us live longer, it'll make us richer, it'll make us freer. And there's a few examples I wanted to give from that. One is this technology called the Replicator, which is this is a screenshot from Star Trek Voyager, one of the 90s Star Trek shows. There's a lot of Star Trek shows. And Captain Janeway loves her coffee. She has to have coffee all the time if she wants to be good at captaining. So it's quite useful for her that she has the technology of the Replicator, which can synthesize anything out of thin air, pretty much. Not quite anything, but most things, especially food and drink. In the future of Star Trek, the Replicator can reconstitute the molecules in the air and make you a cup of coffee or a ham sandwich or whatever you happen to need. Scarcity is basically a thing of the past in the future of Star Trek. There is no poverty, there is no hunger, not because of some government program, but because some people invented a technology that got rid of scarcity. As long as you've got one of these, you're pretty much set. And in Voyager is set on a ship that gets stranded on the other side of the galaxy for 7 years. And yet they're able to keep eating and keep drinking because of this technology. They have a lot of other things, like I was talking about determination before. They have a lot of other challenges they have to get over to escape that situation, but a lack of food is not one of them. And that's why, if you watch Star Trek, the future it depicts is so different from the society we live in. Because it's a post-scarcity society, because it's a society in which technology has solved the problem of food, drink, and basic necessities like that. Another of the cool technologies in Star Trek is the holodeck, something that I think is getting closer and closer to being a reality now, largely because people are inspired by it. And the holodeck's a 3D simulation environment. You can walk into there, you can make anything come true pretty much. And they use it for recreation, obviously. There's episodes where they pretend to be Robin Hood and the Merry Men and they go on adventures and things like that. They also use it for simulations for missions. If you want to go do a mission into a volcano or something dangerous like that, some kind of dangerous environment, it's quite good if you can create a simulation and act out the whole thing first, especially things like dangerous military operations as well. And they also use it for solving crimes. There's one episode where there's surveillance footage of where a murder happened, but you can't see the murderer. And so they recreate the scene on the holodeck, look at the shadows, and create the image of the murderer they're looking for, and they're able to solve it that way. So that's another of the wonderful technologies that Star Trek presents as a possibility. But the thing that I find really interesting in our modern context, because somebody asked the question at the end of the first talk today about the climate change agenda and the sort of attitude that's quite popular now that humans and the environment are opposed to each other, that we are damaging the environment, that we need to reduce the amount that we use the environment and use our technology to improve our lives, we need to fly less and all that kind of stuff. Star Trek actually takes pretty much the opposite idea. It takes the idea that if we want to flourish, we need to increase the extent to which we use our technology to modify our environment. This is a scene of the Enterprise clearing an asteroid field that's threatening a planet. So the idea of going into space to protect ourselves from the natural hazards that space presents, things like asteroids and solar storms and that kind of thing. But also directly interfering in planetary environments. This is from Star Trek Enterprise, and in that show, they terraform Mars. And if you don't know what the word terraform means to make a planet like Earth. And they deliberately crash comets into Mars. They redirect these comets to smash into Mars, to warm it up, to add more water to the atmosphere, to engineer it into a planet that can sustain life. I love that idea, this idea of geoengineering, of creating a world for ourselves. Back home on Earth, in the world of Star Trek, the weather is controlled. There are no cyclones, there are no hurricanes, tornadoes. The weather is under complete human control. So, nature, of course, is a value to human beings, and there are nature reserves. The climate is controlled in a way that enables animal life to flourish as well, because that's something we value too. But the weather is created in such a way that you never have to worry about what we've got going on the river down there at the moment, and in southern Poland right now, all this suffering and damage and destruction from the weather. That's brought completely under control. We solve to the extent that there are problems of climate change at the moment, we solve them using technology, not by rolling back into a sort of pre-technological environment. So I love the idea that not only can technology improve our lives, it can improve our world, it can create a more flourishing environment for us to live in. I'm just going to quickly mention, most of you guys probably watched more than you read, but some people are more book people. If you're more of a book person and you're interested in the technology side of science fiction, this is an author I recommend. He's a guy called Alistair Reynolds. He's a physicist, and so he writes quite hard science fiction. There's quite a lot of science in it. But he does one thing well that I think a lot of hard science fiction writers do badly, which is also tell a story. Because if you have ever read hard science fiction, sometimes it's just the science without the heart. And Reynolds is really, really good at telling interesting character stories with the science as part of the story. And one of the things I like about his universe is there's no faster than light travel. He believes that you will never be able to break the speed of light because it's a physical constant. But he finds ways around that. And in his universe, there are these years-long journeys from one planet to another, and because of how fast these ships are traveling, they're so close to the speed of light. The speed of time is different on different ships and different planets, and so plot lines that are hundreds of years apart will come into alignment through the course of the story. History will influence itself. So it's a really interesting use of that theoretical physics to tell an interesting character story and do things that you can't do in an ordinary story. So the fourth value I want to talk about is really the one that underpins everything I've talked about so far, and that's reason. And you might have got from my introduction that Marco read out that I'm quite interested in reason. I'm writing a book called Reason for Living. And reason is fundamental to the objectivist system of values and to any rational system of values. Without reason, you can't choose a life-serving purpose. You need to use your reasoning mind to choose your goals. And you can't achieve self-esteem without knowing you're rational and pursuing and achieving those goals. So reason really underlies everything. And good science fiction pretty much has reason built into it by its very nature, because you're dealing in a science context. I like to make the point often that if we ever go to Mars in real life, you'll have to be rational on Mars. You don't get to be irrational on Mars because you're in this frontier environment where you need to know how to make oxygen, you need to know how to grow, grow plants, grow food. You need to know how to deal with all these sorts of scientific problems. You have to deal with reality. It's the same thing in the old American West. You had to deal with reality in that environment. It's part of why America is the way it is today. But that's even more true in space. And it's one of the reasons that science fiction kind of has reason in it by default. And so this is a scene from one of the Star Trek movies where they're studying the sort of high energy particles in the nearby area of space, and in doing that they realize that there's a trap waiting for them. There's an area where their sensors won't work and somebody's going to be waiting there to catch them. So that studying of science becomes practically useful just in the way the stories work. But it's also quite explicit a lot of the time. And I prefer it when it is explicit in that way. The Orville is a series that Seth MacFarlane created. You might know him as the creator of Family Guy and American Dad, the comedy shows. And he was a massive Star Trek fan. And he has some funny political ideas, but I think his sort of core values are in the right place. And The Orville is his tribute to Star Trek, really, but it's a bit more comedic. If you like a bit of comedy, it's probably a show you'll enjoy more. But it's also got a lot of really serious points in it. And one of the most serious things it does is it uses this race called the Krill as an allegory for religious fundamentalism, basically. And every time the Krill turn up, their dogmatic beliefs clash with the goals of our heroes. And it's a fairly obvious reference to the damage that religious dogmatism has done in the last couple decades in the real world. Again, it's using allegory. If you did this and you just used real religions from the current world, it wouldn't fly on TV. But if you use aliens, it works. And every time the Krill express the idea that their god gave them a divine right to be the only intelligent species in the galaxy and to have their space to themselves and that kind of stuff. The Orville crew are shocked. They are all rational people. They find these ideas completely unbelievable. When the Krill try to deny that they're threatened by this, another alien force that comes in because their god will protect them, our heroes just dismiss that out of hand. They don't respect their feelings and their religion. They say, that's ridiculous, look at the facts. And that explicit defense of reason is really powerful and really important, and it's something that we need more and more today, because we have this culture now that says you should treat all cultures and all ideas with equal respect, and that's just patently false. You should treat ideas with respect to the extent to which they encourage human life and support human life. And in the case of science fiction, of course, there are other intelligent races, and that's another matter. But as much as an idea enables rational, intelligent beings to survive, it's a good idea. As much as it doesn't, it's a bad idea. And I love the fact that the Orville just handles that straight on. It says that anti-life ideas are destructive and shouldn't be encouraged, even if it's somebody's religion. So I really appreciate that about the Orville. And another series that I think expresses reason really explicitly is actually my all-time favorite TV show is Stargate SG-1. And it's a show about, basically, it's set in the present day, but the US Air Force comes into the possession of a device that enables you to instantly travel to other planets, called the Stargate. And pretty much immediately they realize that the galaxy is overrun by aliens posing as gods, impersonating gods and setting up these tyrannies where they pose as the god and get everyone to worship them. And they're battling with each other and using humans basically as cannon fodder in these wars. And over time, basically across the 10 seasons of this show, it's SG-1, these four guys, and it changes over time, but the core team going around undermining all of these fake religions that these parasitic aliens have set up. And they do that by encouraging people to use reason. They say things like, your God's supposed to be all-powerful, yet he clearly didn't know this invasion was about to happen. Why do you believe in him? And having arguments like that, there's a lot of action too. But reason is really at the core. The guy on the right, the character's name's Daniel Jackson. He's the show's main representative of rational ideas. He's a scientist and archaeologist, and he's always getting into these debates with people. And in the last 2 seasons, there's another race that comes in, well, not race, but another sort of religious group that comes in. And they worship these elemental gods called the Ori. And these things do actually exist, but they're aliens posing as gods. And Daniel gets into a really cool debate with their sort of religious leader. And I want to play you a clip from that if it will cooperate with me. Doesn't seem to be doing it at the moment. I'm just going to come out of this view and go back in again for a second. Please work. 1 second, sorry. Let's reopen. Let's go back into that again. This gives me a chance to have a drink. All right, let's see if we can play now. Any chance? Maybe not. Okay. Well, take my word for it. I've got the quote here. I can read it out to you. So the main religious guy, the guy with the glowing eyes here, shows him this wall of fire, which is these elemental aliens just standing there in front of him. He says, "Can you not believe that this is a god? What is a god but an immensely powerful..." Oh, it may actually be happening now. Maybe I won't need to say anything. Maybe we just have bad internet here. That might be it. Oh, there we go. Really? This is Hungarian internet for you. We'll give it a few seconds and then I will...
The Book of Origin says, those who seek the path to enlightenment must not be led astray.
See, that can be true in a number of different ways. I think maybe I know what the Ori are, who they are. And I'm not denying they're very powerful beings, but if I'm right, they're not gods. They're like the ascended beings I am. They simply have a greater understanding of knowledge of the universe.
What is a god but a being that is worshipped by those beneath? His great knowledge, power, understanding, not enough for you to revere the Ori.
Respect, yes, certainly. It doesn't mean I'm murdering people in their name. I guess what I'm trying to understand is whether the Ori has spoken to you directly, told you to worship, or whether you've misinterpreted some evidence you found along the way and developed this religion on your own. I can't speak for everyone in my house, but in my own humble opinion, I don't believe that any individual or society can achieve enlightenment, fear-mongering, and forced servitude, no matter what power this represents. Now, that's something the ascended beings I know very clearly seem to understand. Don't get me wrong, we should talk about that or something. If essentially what it is the open-ended time machine, it's okay. We should talk about Hitler or not, or only free will. For saying that is what I believe.
So he says that even if we're trying to achieve enlightenment, which is what the Ori are claiming to offer, we should all get there of our own free will. And then on the end he says, kill me for saying that if you will, but that's what I believe. So you get that sense of determination as well, not determinism. And I love the fact that Daniel just openly attacks and criticizes this guy's devout religion and says, maybe you just misinterpreted the whole thing. Maybe you need to look at the facts more realistically. And there are multiple times in Stargate where you get that explicit idea that individuals should use their own minds to look at reality. Every individual should use his or her own free will to decide what's true, to decide what life means, to decide what the proper way to live is. And that's just a crucial part of reason. But it's also something that follows from reason is the idea that we are individuals. We all have our own individual minds, and we can only reason for ourselves. And that leads me on to my next value, which is individualism. And to talk about individualism, I want to talk about what's probably the most interesting concept for an alien race from any sci-fi show I know. And that's a race from Star Trek called the Borg. And they're introduced in Star Trek The Next Generation in the late 80s. And the Borg, this guy here on the right is a Borg drone. And the reason he's called a drone is that the Borg are a collective consciousness. They only have one mind. They don't have individual personalities. Basically, the Borg fly around. They're cybernetic, so they're half human, half animal, half technology, basically. Half alive, half machine. And they fly around assimilating people into their collective. They come along, and every time they introduce themselves, they say, "We are the Borg, you will be assimilated, resistance is futile." And they bury your personality, bury your individuality, and make you a drone, and build you into their collective. And right from the first time they're introduced, the Borg are really interesting for that reason. You're never fighting individuals, you can't reason with them, you're fighting one face of this collective mind. And it's almost a sort of explicit metaphor for communism, really. But what gets really interesting is later on in the Borg storylines, the crew of the Enterprise start rescuing drones from the collective. They start breaking people out of this collective mind. And these sort of separated drones are completely lost. They're used to having these voices in their heads. They don't know what to think. They don't know what to believe. And they have to rebuild their identities, rebuild their individual consciousness, rebuild their sense of who they are completely from scratch. And that's a really interesting idea, and it creates several of the most interesting storylines in all of Star Trek. This is from the first episode where that happens. They name this guy Hugh because the Borg don't have names. They give each other designations. You're 3rd of 5, 7 of 9. But they give him a name, they try and help him rediscover his identity, his individuality. This happens a couple more times throughout Star Trek, but the most interesting one is in Voyager. 7 of 9 on the right, she chooses to keep her Borg name, 7 of 9, and she becomes a regular character on the show, and she's in it for 4 seasons. And all 4 of those seasons, her whole story arc is her building herself her new identity, her new character. And she becomes very adamant about rescuing other drones from the collective, and when a group of others are disconnected and the Voyager crew find them, it looks like they're going to die if they're not returned to the collective. And 7 says, I simply want them to experience individuality as I have. If we told them to become drones again, they would resist. They would choose freedom, no matter how fleeting. And the guy she's talking to agrees and says, survival is insufficient. So I love that. Survival is insufficient. It's not enough to be alive. You have to be free. You have to be able to make your own choices, to have your own identity. Without that, life is not meaningful. And there's a number of interesting exchanges where the Borg try and retake 7. This is a screenshot where the Borg queen, they have a sort of bee-like queen, and she tries to take her back at one point, and 7 asks, why do you want me? You've got all these planets you invade all the time. And she tells 7, you're the only Borg that has ever returned to a state of individuality. We want to keep you exactly the way you are. Otherwise, you would lose your human perspective. We don't want another drone. We want you. We want this individual, this person who's managed to fully reconstruct their identity as a human being. The Borg are constantly struggling with the fact that even though they're technologically superior to us, we keep beating them because we can come up with different ideas, because we have individual minds that are capable of thinking for themselves, and they want to capture that and rediscover that thing they've lost, that ability to think for yourself, to have a diversity of opinions, a diversity of thought. And that leads me into another value I want to talk about, one that's obviously going to resonate with a lot of people here, which is freedom. And to talk about freedom, I'm going to mention a show called Earth Final Conflict, which was made after Gene Roddenberry died, the creator of Star Trek, but based on some of his notes and ideas. And by the way, only the first season of this show is good. The first season of this show is outstanding. The other seasons are terrible. It's a really sad situation. But that first season is gold, and if you can get hold of it, I thoroughly recommend watching it. It's a really interesting show because these aliens on the left, called the Talons, have basically come to Earth in a very near future and said, we can solve all your problems, all your diseases, all your poverty, all your wars, everything. We can deal with all of that. We will come in and help you. We'll just give you advice and help you and show you the way to improve and become more like us. And they recruit this guy, Neil Boone, to be one of their liaisons with the human race. But he's secretly also working for the Resistance because he's become aware that they're not everything they're cracked up to be, that they have a nefarious side to them. And the show is really about this particular Talon that Boone becomes friends with, discovering why human individuality and human freedom is so important. And this Talon asks him at one point, what is an acceptable cost in human life to find the cures for your most feared diseases? And Boone says every human being would answer that question differently, but the key is that humans must answer that question for themselves. Later, he asks, your government is in on everything we're doing. Doesn't that tell you that humans do agree with it? And Boone says, our history shows that governments do not always act in the best interests of their people. And then in another conversation, the Talon asks him, why do you guys put so much effort into space exploration? And Boone says, at our core, human beings have a basic need to dream, and space exploration is at the heart of those dreams. Without it, we cease to be human. So the whole show is basically about discovering humanity, explaining humanity. The Talons also have a kind of collective consciousness. They are individuals, but they share their thoughts with each other. They don't really understand human individuality and why we place value on a single human life. And Boone is often having to explain that principle to him. And it's a fascinating, by removing you from the situation where we just take that for granted and introducing a race that doesn't have that doesn't have individuality the same way we do, it gives us a chance to explore it without being, without proselytizing, without being pontificating about it. It's not like we're just abstractly saying, individuality is important. We can actually tell a story that shows why it's important in an interesting way. And then one other show I'll talk about, which I mentioned earlier, is Blake 7, which is a good example of a sci-fi dystopia that expresses positive values. If you're interested in dystopian fiction, it's a British show from the late 70s, and there are no aliens in Blake 7. It's all human beings, at least for the most part, and basically it's a totalitarian dystopian future in space where there's a great federation across multiple planets, but they suppress human life enormously. They punish, kill, imprison people who disagree with them. And a bunch of prisoners, a bunch of political prisoners, escape and steal a starship and name it the Liberator, and fly around basically causing trouble for the Federation and trying to free as many places as possible, help resistance movements. And all the time, these are happy people who would be living flourishing lives if they weren't in this society, but they have to fly around and become freedom fighters to survive in it. It's got great dialogue, great characters. It's really an enjoyable show to watch. But overall, there's just an unquestioned sense that all these very different people with different ideas share that freedom is vital, that freedom is an essential part of human life. And it's one of my favorite shows for dealing with that principle. I love the fact that the core crew are escaped prisoners, but they're the good guys. And then just two other shows I'll mention quickly. Well, firstly, a book. If you're into books and you want something that deals with freedom really well, Robert Heinlein's The Moon is a Harsh Mistress is a really good book to read. And then also, I said I wouldn't talk about Star Wars, but I will mention Andor, which is sort of doesn't really need to be a Star Wars show. It could have been its own show. But the reason I put these side by side is that these are both stories in which the lead character doesn't initially understand why freedom is important and learns that through the story. And I think that's one of the most valuable stories you can tell. It's not just where, here's a freedom fighter, watch him fight for freedom. It's, here's a guy who doesn't really care about freedom and then through his own experiences learns why it matters. And The Moon is a Harsh Mistress does that really well. Andor is all about Cassian Andor, going from, I don't care, it's not my fight, to, we really need to overthrow the Empire. And it's only 10 episodes and it does that really, really well. So two things there if you want other examples of shows or books that defend freedom well. And then my second last value, as I say, I've got 8 values in total, is civilization. Also one for the readers. These are artworks from the covers of Isaac Asimov's Foundation series. And Esther mentioned Asimov earlier in her AI presentation. He's the guy who came up with the laws of robotics. But he also created this universe called the Foundation universe. And just to briefly summarize, Foundation is all about a guy, he's a statistician, I can't say that word. He's a guy who does statistics. And he does all these predictions, and he realizes through his predictions that he thinks it's a mathematical certainty that his civilization is going to collapse. He lives in this galactic empire, basically, and he calculates it's going to collapse soon. And he starts setting up these things called foundations, which are designed to shorten the Dark Age before civilization returns. And across the main trilogy of the Foundation novels, you see the collapse of the civilization, you see its rebirth, and you're all the time just motivated to protect and defend civilization. And civilization is such an important value. It's what enables us to, not have a ridiculously small infant survival rate. What enables us to live past an average of 30. What enables us to have conferences, and have chocolate bars and all the other things we like about civilized society. And I love this series. And by the way, if you're a Star Wars fan, it's really obvious that George Lucas got a lot of ideas from these books. The Empire and Foundation, its central planet is this planet-wide city, just like Coruscant in Star Wars. And it's the same kind of like galactic empire concept, but done in a more philosophically interesting way, where the real values at stake are the ideas of, do we want people to live in a stable civilization or out on the fringes in this sort of collapsing society? And I really love fighting for civilization. I think that's such a valuable thing to do. And one other show I'll mention that's really good for that is a show called Andromeda, again based on ideas by Gene Roddenberry. And that's a show about a captain in the army of a great systems commonwealth, it's called, another great galactic civilization. But he gets trapped in a sort of time warp and misses a couple centuries and wakes up to find that the whole thing's collapsed. They lost a war and the civilization he knew and loved has disappeared. And he sets himself the goal of rebuilding it on his own. One ship, one man, and he's going to restart civilization. I really like the opening narration from the show. It says, "The long night has come. The systems commonwealth, the greatest civilization in history, has fallen. But now one ship, one crew, have vowed to drive back the night and rekindle the light of civilization. On the starship Andromeda, hope lives again." And it's kind of a dystopia. It's kind of a post-society situation, but it's a guy trying to put all that back, trying to rebuild society. And across the 5 seasons of this show, he does a lot of that. He does a lot of rebuilding society, of reforging alliances, of recreating civilization. And then the last value I want to talk about is the value that really underpins every other value. It's the value of life. Life is what it's all about. Human life, the life of sentient beings in general in a science fiction context. And every show I've talked about so far values life. Star Trek, the original series, was famous for one of the famous phrases that came from that show was IDIC, I think it was called, infinite diversity and infinite combinations. That's not really diversity in its modern meaning, that's the idea of a diversity of life, a diversity of things around you, of the richness of life around you. And Star Trek was all about protecting life, of finding new life, discovering new life and new civilizations was the tagline of Star Trek. And reveling in that diversity, reveling in everything that the world offers us and all the life that's around us. But I want to take the opportunity to focus on one other show, which is Babylon 5, which is a show that was kind of inspired by Star Trek but took a different direction. Babylon 5 set on a space station called Babylon 5, and that station was created after a giant galactic war to try and stop other wars. It's created as a place of diplomacy where different alien species can come together, learn about each other, understand each other. And it's described in the show as a place of diplomacy for 250,000 humans and aliens, a shining beacon in space all alone in the night. And that idea of the light versus the dark is a central theme that runs through Babylon 5. It was the first show really to have an integrated story across its whole run. The whole arc was planned out before the show started. So every season knew where it was going. The guy who created it, J. Michael Straczynski, had a whole plan from the start. So it really delivers on its story promises. It's not just made up as it went along. And that the whole story is about light versus dark. Two great ancient races. One thinks that we should have freedom and choose our own path. The other thinks that conflict is the way to decide who's the greatest. Sort of social Darwinist idea. And that every conflict in this show, on a personal level and on a galactic level, is about light versus dark, life versus death. One side always represents the light, one side always represents the dark. And one thing I think we've talked a few times at conferences like this about trying to reclaim words like liberal and capitalism, words like that. I would really like to reclaim the phrase pro-life to literally mean in favor of life, just generally. Disconnect it from the abortion issue and just have that mean somebody who advances life, because I don't know what else to call that. And if you say you're pro-life, everyone thinks it means you're anti-abortion, but being pro-life should mean you support life. And I love shows that explicitly do that explicitly value the survival and flourishing of living beings. And I'll come back to Doctor Who briefly before I finish and say that applies on an individual level as well. Doctor Who says that some people live more in 20 years than others do in 80. It's not the time that matters, it's the person. Every individual life matters. And Doctor Who, by the way, is all about living life to the full. I mentioned curiosity at the start, and I'll come back to that now. It's a Doctor Who. He's an alien. He's hundreds of years old. He flies around through space and time, but he always picks up a human to take with him, his companion. Sometimes there's a couple. Usually there's just one. And he gives this person the opportunity to see the universe, see the history, see the future. And he chooses the people who have the right mindset for that, the people who want to see the world, the people who are stuck in a council house in the south of London but really want to get out and see the galaxy, and he gives them that opportunity. It's all about living life to the full, and that celebrates something that I think is really important, that life is not just about being alive, it's about living fully. Life means living as a human being as fully as you can. And we should all try to do that. We should all try to maximize the value we get out of our lives. But also, Doctor Who puts a lot of value on life in the traditional sense. He tries to avoid using weapons and violence at all costs. Not all costs, but as much as he can. He only ever does it when it's necessary. Otherwise, he tries to fix problems with his mind and his screwdriver and things like that, and find a scientific way out of or a diplomatic way out of a situation rather than resorting to violence. And through celebrating all these values, science fiction has had a lot of influence in our world. I mentioned the cell phone at the start. Also, the team that are working on the Amazon Alexa were inspired by Star Trek. The head of that team, she's talked about that, about the fact that in Star Trek, you just say, computer, lights on, computer, tell me about the First Punic War or whatever you want to learn about. And the computer will just do that for you. And she wanted to create that in the real world, and Alexa is the attempt to do that. It's interesting that the Star Trek set 300 years in the future, and some of the technologies it predicted have already come true. Others are nowhere near happening, may never happen, but some are already happening now, and partly because it's influenced people to advocate for that kind of society of technological flourishing. So if you're interested in what I've talked about, over at the OSI table I have a booklet with some articles about some of these shows I've talked about. I'm writing a book, as I said, about reason and how to use those values to flourish in life. The values I've talked about today has a chapter in it about education, about entertainment and TV shows and books more generally, not just science fiction. And that QR code will take you to my blog where I write about this as well. There's one of those over on the table there. And I'll give you a second to take pictures of that. But it's over there as well if you want to look at it. And then I will finish up on a slide that lists everything I've mentioned and a few other recommendations. If you want to check out any of these shows or read any of these books, these are all ones that celebrate the values I've talked about today. And I'll leave you there and open up to questions. Thank you.
Because I'm writing books, and it's not fully, but I can say that it's good attempt of sci-fi books, so it was very, very interesting for me, and thank you for that. So my question is that books and TV shows and movies you have presented here in a brilliant way, I can say, they are old generation films, movies and TV shows. So what's your opinion? Why don't you, at the end we saw Under, which is my favorite also, but why don't you use, because we have a lack of this kind of films and TV shows right now, what's the reason? Thank you.
Wow, just a small question. Yeah, Andor is a real exception to the current trends in TV, and I'm amazed it happened. It's considering how many of the other Star Wars shows are just kind of bland and repetitive, and they're just content for content's sake. But and there's a lot of reasons for it. There are some sort of more practical ones about the financial incentives in streaming, the way shows are made now, and there's the fact that a lot of the people making shows now are sort of fanboys from 30 years ago who are just making what they wanted to see when they were kids, and they've never really grown up, and they're just putting that into action. But I think a lot of the art of storytelling's been lost to some extent. A lot of writers nowadays don't know how to create a compelling character, don't know what values they're putting into what they're writing, or they don't think about values. And I see this when I talk to people in my generation. I'm a millennial, I grew up in the 90s and 2000s, and people who grew up at the same time as me, if I talk to them about a movie, if I go see a movie with my sort of friends at home who aren't Liberty Movement or anything like that, they're just regular people. If I go to a movie with them, I'll come out and say, "What do you think?" And they say, "Oh yeah, it was great. I enjoyed the fight sequence or whatever." And I say, "Yeah, what do you think about the ideas?" And they have no idea what I mean. People do not think about the themes and values, and that includes the writers of these shows, and books and things like that. Books is different because people put more thought into writing a book than writing a TV show generally, but a lot of these shows, some of them are just overtly bad in values. Like some of them are explicitly conveying bad values, like anti-human values or anti-reason. Some of them, a lot of them, I think, are making an honest attempt to convey some good ideas, but they're bungling the delivery of them and the interpretation of them. The new Star Trek shows, the most recent ones, like Strange New Worlds and Discovery, very much fall into that category of they're trying to be good, and they don't really know how to. They don't understand the values they're trying to express. And then sometimes they just don't know how to write, and they bungle it on that level. And there's just a lack of professionalism and a lack of clarity. And to write good stories, like J. Michael Straczynski, the guy who did Babylon 5, he had absolute clarity on what he wanted to create, and he just made that thing precisely. He wrote a Bible for it before he started, like this whole plan. And people don't have that kind of clarity a lot of the time now. And Andor was an exception. The third season of Star Trek Picard was an exception, but most of the time it doesn't happen like that. And it's even if you look at movies from about 20 years ago, the change is enormous. If you compare the Star Wars prequels to what's coming out now, they're so much richer in ideas. Even if it's not done brilliantly, it's so much better than what's done now. So, wokeism and that kind of thing, some of the bad ideas, that's part of the problem, but a lot of it is just not thinking about ideas or not having a backbone when network executives tell you you've got to stick this in your show, and they just say, oh wait, whatever, we've got to do it, and not being prepared to do what a few filmmakers will do and stand up and say, no, I'm going to do it my way or not at all. And there's people like Christopher Nolan who will do that, but most filmmakers and TV writers just don't have that attitude anymore, sadly. It's become a kind of production machine instead. There's always been a bit of that, but it's grown worse recently. But hopefully some people will turn the tide. Hey, Harrison.
As you know, I also lent on Star Wars and also was, hugely heartened by Andor. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. But, it's not a particularly fan statement to say that free market capitalism is a necessary but certainly not a sufficient condition for widespread good art. You've already alluded to this fact, right? Andor didn't stream that well, unfortunately, and lots of crap does. So how does this change? Does it come from the top down? Is it people like Christopher Nolan saying, sod it, I'm doing well, I'm doing it, who cares what happens? Or is it bottom up? Is it, we've got to make them fail until they eventually try the right thing? Or indeed a bit of both? How do we change it? How do we get more Andor and less whatever the rest of it is?
There's an important broader point in your question, which is people blame capitalism for problems that are caused by other factors. Capitalism is an excellent engine for giving people what they want, and if people want crap, it will make crap. And we see that played out everywhere, not just in art, although it is played out in art. Jersey Shore exists because people want it. And that's true with movies and TV shows and everything. It's also true with food. Like the complete, if you go to an American grocery store, Mountain Dew, 70 grams of sugar, people want that, so they make it. And then we try and regulate, and it just create new problems in trying to fix the problem. The problem is the values in the culture. And that has deteriorated recently. But it's always been there to some extent. There's always been bad stuff. There's always been, there's some complete top from the 70s as well. But, it's got worse recently because I think there's been a deterioration in the prominent values in the culture. And the way to fix that is partly through education. Education is pretty much at the root of every problem in our society. People aren't taught good values, or even more so aren't taught to think for themselves about these ideas, to think critically about philosophy, about values, about art. This is why people go into movies and don't think about the ideas, is they've not been taught to look for the ideas. They've been taught to analyze a sentence in a book and, is the author using this technique in this sentence, but not to ask what's the author's actual philosophical conviction here. And in a way that's interesting and engaging. So it really needs to start with education, but also people creating stuff like Andor, like putting stuff out there that does that, helps educate people. The reason I'm here, the reason I do objectivism and talk about philosophy is because of Star Trek. Star Trek introduced me to philosophy, introduced me to science, introduced me to rationality, curiosity, and then other things. It led me to discover and research those ideas in detail. But there's so much I learned from that show and from other shows like it. And if those things are out there, there's hope. The fact that Andor's out there gives me hope. But there's less and less of it now. And even the new Star Trek, the new Star Wars, the new Lord of the Rings, all that kind of stuff is just so terrible. It's so depressing and dispiriting. That, I find myself taking refuge in the 90s and finding new 90s shows. I'm watching Sequest at the moment just to get back into that happier period. And we can't do that forever. We need people to create more good art. And it's something I want to do later in my life as well. But we've got to understand these values and create things that convey them well.
Such an engaging talk.
Thanks.
Thank you for all the work with the pictures, videos, really fantastic. And your live text was brilliant. Well done. You really warmed my heart with the idea about the comment, like redirecting the comment into my entirely new idea. So lovely. One science fiction recommendation I want to make is Nosedive, the episode of Black Mirror.
Oh.
If you've seen that, I think it's one of the most important recent pieces of science fiction that I've watched. And related to that, if you've seen it, you said earlier about the smartphone reliance. For you personally, would you want to be more reliant on your smartphone or less?
Okay, I've only watched a little Black Mirror. Black Mirror is an anthology series, kind of like The Twilight Zone and The Outer Limits, so each episode is a completely disconnected story. And shows like that can be amazing. Black Mirror fluctuates enormously between being amazing and being just god-awful, and it really depends which individual episode you watch. So I've not watched that particular one, but what did you say it's called, like Downfall or something?
It's called Nosedive.
Nosedive, I will check that one out. I hated the Star Trek one, the Callisto one, that wasn't good at all. But so that's on that issue, but interesting stuff in that show sometimes. on the question of, do I want to be more reliant on technology? No, I want to use technology to enhance what my mind can do. I want to be reliant on my mind first of all. And I think what a lot of people do is most people in this room won't come into this, but people out there in the world who we want to reach and change, let their technology substitute their minds. Forget how to read a map, forget how to cook a meal without Googling it, that kind of thing. And that's not what technology is supposed to do, but it's what it will do in a society where people aren't taught to think independently. But in a society where people are, I don't think it would do that. And in the world of Star Trek, people use the technology to replicate themselves a cello and learn how to play it, not to scroll cat videos all day. Scrolling cat videos is fine for 5 minutes, but don't do it addictively. And technology should be an aid to enable you to flourish as a human being, which means using your mind to solve problems to flourish in life. It doesn't mean becoming a surrogate for the world and hide on the. And actually, both Star Trek and the Orville have done episodes about holodeck addiction, where the idea of having this virtual environment, people use it for the obvious thing that people are going to try and use it for, So there's sex on the one hand, but there's also an episode of Voyager where somebody gets a thrill addiction and just uses it to dive off cliffs and stuff like that all the time, and just gets this unhealthy addiction to the technology. And it always runs the message of, this is a great tool, but use it sensibly. And your reason should always be in the front. Don't let technology run your life for you. Use it to enhance your life.
Personal question. I'm not very experienced in science fiction, but I'm a fan of Heinlein books. And now I'm more often hear about the blue CC, this Chinese.
Oh, the three-body problem. Yeah.
I heard that he built a unique universe, and I'm about to start reading it, but maybe you could share your experience if you were there.
I've had relatively little. I watched some of the Chinese version. I haven't watched the Netflix version. I've watched a chunk of the Chinese version, which I found really interesting. I've not read the books yet. I'm a really slow reader, so it takes me a long time to get through books. I'm fascinated by it from what I've seen of the Chinese show. I want to read the books. It's on my reading list, but I haven't actually got through them yet. It's just a matter of time until I will. But yeah, it's interesting and encouraging that something like that's dealing that cerebrally with a science concept is hitting the mass market. It shows that there is a market. And a lot of the time, just publishers and networks aren't prepared to take the risk on creating that kind of content. And when they do it, that's another to the earlier question about why is this changing? Why is good stuff not being made anymore? Is a lack of willingness to take risks on the part of publishers and studios. Every movie now is a sequel or a remake or something. People don't do good original stuff anymore, and it's an unwillingness to go outside the box to try new things. And when you do try new things, sometimes it will fail. Like I said, success requires failure, but sometimes you'll produce a Jurassic Park or something like that just changes the cinema landscape or the book landscape overnight. And we've also got a diversification effect now where there's more stuff in publishing and in film, but more so in books. There's more out there, and it's harder to find the good stuff, but there's more of it. There's more people writing and creating than ever, and it's easier to publish than ever, but then you've got this huge volume of stuff to wade through to find the gold nuggets. It's the same with music, which John will talk about on Wednesday. There's so much now, but you've really got to know where to look to find it, and sometimes, occasionally, something rises to the surface like that. And we've got to try and expose and highlight those things more. Anything else, or are we out of time? Oh, one, Daniel? Oh, no, or clapping. Whatever.
Thank you very much for